Hello, everybody. We should be live now. I'm going to give it just another minute for people to trickle in and stuff like we've done before. If you can hear me, though, and if everything sounds great, just let me know down in the comments. Or if you don't want to leave comments about audio or anything like that, just tell me where you're from here, like who's viewing and things. I'd love to hear from you before we get started on our discussion of Stoicism and virtues. While we do that, I'm just going to kind of like look around on my notes, make sure I'm all prepared, but I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And we'll try to get started in 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Okay, is there... Let me see. What is... Okay, all right. Well, as I wait for some of those to start trickling in, let's just give a little bit of an introduction to what it is that we want to talk about when we're talking about virtue in general, right? Or like why we would bother to talk about Stoic virtues. So the main reason that we would ever want to talk about virtue is really to try to understand actually a completely different kind of moral framework that the Stoics and other ancient philosophers used in order when they talked about ethics in a way that really nowadays, I mean, it's seen a resurgence lately. It's not like it's like completely out of there, but it's not quite how we talk about things anymore, right? So virtue or virtue ethics, basically ethics that is concerned with virtue, is primarily about figuring out what kind of a person you want to be, or what kind of a person you ought to be, which is pretty different than ethical theories, which are more about assessing certain kinds of actions, right? So I don't know, you may have heard of this stuff called the trolley problem, or about Kantianism or anything like that. And if you've read any of those things, then you should if you've read like the trolley problem or anything like that, then what you've done is you've learned a little bit about utilitarianism. And when you've learned about utilitarianism, basically what has happened is we've tried to say, like, what should the person in the trolley do in order to like maximize pleasure? That's basically the problem that we're having, that they have. And they're trying to figure this out using like a utilitarian calculus, right? Or if you're a Kantian, it's about determining what is the character of the moral law, which is like universal and binds everybody, right? The virtue ethicist really isn't concerned with that kind of stuff. It's not concerned with those particular actions. Instead, virtue ethics is primarily concerned with the type of person that you are, the character of a person. If you wanted like a really kind of gentle introduction to talking about virtue, then the thing that I would highly recommend is reading Massimo Pigliucci's book, his newer book on character. He wrote a book on character about leadership and things like this, and it's a nice like gentle introduction into this general way of thinking. Now, I'm going to have to pause everything for just a second and play around with it because on my end, I know that there are people commenting because I can see it when I look on my phone, but on like my computer, I can't see it like at all. And that is not good. So I'm going to riff for a second. I can't see comments in my chat. See what happens. Okay, well, I will try to monitor, unfortunately, on my phone as well to look at questions. That's not the ideal situation, but StreamYard is being a little strange for me today. Okay, so what is virtue? Well, virtue is deeply tied in with a lot of other ancient Greek notions, such as eudaimonia, or flourishing, or teleology. And that is all a bunch of vocabulary that I need to define. And I'm sorry, I have to chat with StreamYard to try to fix this while they're doing this. Okay, so eudaimonia is a funny Greek word, that it's got that U in front of it. That's basically like a good thing. And basically that we can say here is just that eudaimonia is human flourishing. Sometimes this is translated as happiness. People will talk about virtue ethics being concerned with human happiness. I have found that is not maybe the best way for us to translate it in a way that makes sense to most readers, right? Because happiness, if you're like a modern reader and you read about happiness, what are you thinking, right? You're probably thinking about a feeling. You're thinking about a way of feeling happy. And then I'm going to ask, what makes you happy? And you're going to list experiences mostly. And those experiences are the kinds of things that bring oh my goodness, StreamYard is telling me there's no way for me to read my chat today, which is, okay, I'm going to just have to look at my phone and do it. We will do this all together. Okay, anyway, if you're thinking about happiness, nowadays you think about experiences and you think about sensations and things like that. You can try. Oh my gosh, StreamYard is not helping me at all. They want me to disconnect everything and then reconnect everything, and that is not going to happen because I'm in the middle of the stream. So okay, so we are trying to think. So we're not going to talk about human happiness today. We're just going to talk about flourishing, and that's going to be the phrase that we use. So unfortunately, though, we still need to figure out like what human flourishing is. And for that, it is very helpful for us to also rely on like another Greek term, which is teleology. Teleology, if it has this word telos in it or telos in it, which points to like the ends of things. And we don't mean end as in like finality. We mean end as like the point or purpose. Like, to what end are we doing this? Like, that's the kind of meaning that we have when we talk about a telos. And on a kind of common understanding of teleology, or a common understanding that was a common understanding in the ancient Greek world, everything had a telos. Everything had like a point to it or a function. That is not how we typically think about things nowadays. We kind of had like the Newtonian revolution. We think more in terms of cause and effect rather than in teleological explanations. Many people don't believe in like some kind of like designer or something which could like imbue teleology into like functions and things like this. Because of that, teleology is one thing that a lot of people kind of stumble on when they're talking about this. But I like teleology. I think it makes sense for us to talk about teleology. And one of the ways that you might say this is like, what is it characteristic of a human being to do, right? What is it like? What would we say is like a good version of a human being? And that kind of language can seem a little odious, right? We get a little worried because we start worrying that we're going to start comparing people and saying that like some kinds of people are better than other kinds of people. That's not what we mean. We're talking about individuals, and we say we're like, that person is doing well. That person is doing well, and they're like doing well kind of like as a human being. There was a question in the chat that just said, can you translate telos as like a goal as well? There is a sense in which it's like a goal. The problem with translating it like goal is just that goals are also subjective. People can choose their own goals, right? But for any of the thinkers that we're going to talk about tonight, namely, we're going to talk about the Stoics, we're going to talk about Aristotle. For any of those thinkers, telos would not be subjective. You could not like choose a new telos for yourself. Instead, telos is something that's like given to you by nature because of like the kind of thing that you are, right? That's the that's the reason that I won't say goal here, even though there is something here that's like really similar. So thank you for that question. And again, folks, if you're joining in a little bit late, my streaming platform has informed me that I can't read the chat on my screen, so I'm like looking at my phone at the same time. So I apologize if my eyes are always darting around. Okay, so the best way then I think for us to talk about teleology or anything like this, talking about characteristic, is to say that someone is virtuous when they are living according to their nature, right? And this is something that all of us have in common, right? Our human nature. Someone has asked if telos is a Greek word. Yeah, it's a Greek word. And all of our reference points today are Greek. I'm sure you could think about like tell us. I'm sure that there's some kind of similar ideas in other traditions as well. The Greek one is the one I know better than others, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so the virtues are basically just like how are you being the best sort of human being? How are you living in accordance with nature? How are you flourishing? All of these, when you kind of get wrapped up in this teleological worldview, um, all of you it starts to kind of sound a little bit synonymous. So we're going to be a little fast and loose with the different kinds of terminology that we're saying here. I see someone saying howdy from Austin, Texas, and I can say howdy from Austin, Texas as well. Okay, so now like once we have like this general idea of like what virtue is, we have like the next step of figuring out what the virtues are, right? So what are the different ways in which you can be sort of excellent? And there's a very, very old tradition of answering that question by listing 4 virtues. So those virtues are prudence, courage, temperance, and justice. Now, I can imagine that already people have questions about like why are there only 4 and why are those the only 4? Now, I believe that the first person to give this list as the 4 cardinal virtues, as they get called, is Plato. I believe it's Plato who lists them first. But it seems like a lot of the Greeks agreed, and Aristotle seems to be okay with this list, though he lists more than 4 virtues. But this list is included in his larger list. Then also. Later on in like the West, when you'd have like figures like Thomas Aquinas incorporating Greek philosophy into like their theology, they would add 3 virtues: faith, hope, and love, on to come up with they'll call those the theological virtues. But the point is the 4 cardinal virtues remain, right? Now, the idea though is that if there are other virtues, at least most of them can be sort of seen as types of these 4 broad virtues. So the 4 cardinal virtues are really big tents. They contain other virtues within them. And so focusing on these 4 virtues, I think is going to be pretty sufficient for us thinking about this. Now, as I talk about the 4 virtues in particular, we're going to talk about some of their definitions and stuff and talk about examples. But I think it would be good for us to really keep in mind how you can like take that stuff about virtue and then like apply it to your life immediately. I think if you wanted to just learn about like the theoretical parts of virtue, you'd go take a philosophy class at a university. If you want to learn a little bit more of the practical stuff here, you come to me on YouTube, I guess. So we'll talk about some of the practical sides as well as we talk about this. But there's a good question in the chat from Daniel who asked, like, how does one pursue the virtues without it being a narcissistic pursuit? So there's a 2-part answer to this. That's a good question. It's the kind of question I wish I could put on screen. I'm sorry that StreamYard's not letting me. The first part of that, the first reason that it's not narcissistic is one that it is not narcissistic to better yourself. It can become narcissistic if all of your focus is on yourself, right? The narcissist is incapable of being concerned with someone else's well-being or incapable of putting someone else incapable of putting someone's interests above their own or anything like this. Everything is always done through the self. I see someone is telling me also I'm banned on I think on 4chan. Okay. Anyway, the narcissist is the narcissist incapable of putting anyone in front of themselves. And the virtues do not lead you to narcissism. In fact, this is the second part of the answer. That the second part of the answer is that the virtues actually point you towards other people as well. So we often have this idea of like Stoicism as like highly individualistic, but that's actually not true. The Stoics actually have there's a highly social component to the kinds of things that they teach when you talk about the virtues. One of the problems with the way that people talk about Stoicism online is that they don't talk about the virtues enough, which means they don't talk about other people enough. And if they don't talk about other people enough, it does become narcissistic, or at the very least, it can become selfish. But if we're talking about Stoicism or the virtues or any of that stuff, we don't want to be narcissist and we don't want to be selfish. So that's why we're going to talk about the virtues. I hope that helps a little bit. It's just asking, so is all of this interconnected? All of these concepts are interconnected. Absolutely. They're like a big web of ways of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that is foreign to many of us. It is not how many of us like to think about ethics, just because it's just not our default state. It's not what we were raised in and stuff. So it's important to explain all of these concepts together in a way that can hopefully, I don't know, do some good, or like to sort of all of the parts start shining a light on the whole, and the whole starts shining a light on all of the parts, or something like that. Great question so far, guys. I'm really, really happy to see this. All right, cool. So I'm not going to go in the exact order that I announced them, where I said prudence, courage, temperance, and justice, because prudence I want to talk about last. So let's start by talking. Oh, someone asked really quickly, how did the four virtues of Stoicism compare with the three Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity? Charity, also translated as love, comes from caritas, right? So importantly, what happens, like when the Christian West especially tries to incorporate Greek ethics, they add the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, into their list of virtues. That changes the whole structure of the virtues, but they don't abandon the four cardinal virtues. So anyone who's writing in that tradition is still going to talk about the necessity of prudence, courage, temperance, and justice. You need them all. And then someone just asked, in Lessons of Stoicism, they say the cardinal virtues are wisdom, justice, courageousness, and moderation. Okay, this is a good point here. And I was going to go through this as I talked about each one of them. All of these words are being translated. And because they're being translated, you can translate them in multiple ways. And I'll try to point out closely related words for them. I hope that helps as we talk about each of those here. So let's talk about courage first. Now, courage is a really interesting virtue, because when I was like teaching ethics, I think I learned that nobody knows what courage is. And that's because we have this tendency to call people courageous when they've been successful. And by that, I mean, if they do something risky and it pays off, we say that was very courageous of them. And then if they do something risky and then they fail, we say that was foolhardy or reckless. But that's not how Aristotle wanted us to think about them, right? And that's going to be my first reference for courage. Success and failure are not necessarily what makes an action courageous. So obviously, when we're talking about something being courageous, it does mean you're taking on a risk, right? It usually means there's some kind of danger. When Aristotle talks about risk, he almost always is like directly talking about bodily harm or the fact that you might die. Like those are the kinds of things that Aristotle has in mind when he talks about courage. And he loves to use military examples. The Athenians loved the military. And so there was, some, very militaristic spirit, let's say that. And so they're going to use soldiers on the battlefield all the time, but we don't have to just use those. So for courage, we might say that it's the virtue that helps you, or that describes how we handle danger or how we endure things that we don't want to undergo, such as pain. Like, how can you endure pain or discomfort? Well, courage is the virtue you have if you are going to be able to do those things. Now, one of the ways that Aristotle likes to talk about the virtues, and I really like this way of doing things, is to talk about the virtues as sitting somewhere in the middle between vices. So if virtues are us living according to our nature, vices are us living against our nature. And here are the vices that courage sits in between. On the one hand, you have cowardice. And the coward is someone who will not undergo any danger or risk, even if it would be for a worthy cause, right? Or even if there was good reason, or even in fact, if there was a good chance of his survival or something like this in order to do something good. Because remember, we're always dealing with like probabilities here, like that you're dealing with a risk of being injured or something like this. And then on the other extreme, you have recklessness, sometimes called foolhardiness. And someone who's reckless is too willing to go into danger, either for some reason that doesn't justify it, meaning that it's like you're putting yourself in danger just to like look cool or something like this, or you're putting yourself into danger when you don't have a good chance or even like a small chance of surviving. So I think an example that gets used a lot is like, imagine a young man who wants to run into a burning building to save his family or to save someone, right? But there's no chance of his survival. Like the flames are too high. There's just no way for him to survive. Aristotle would actually say that's reckless. That's not courageous. Now, we still sometimes that look at that, with recklessness, we actually usually say that the reckless person is at least a little more admirable than the person who is cowardly, because at least they were willing to put others before themselves. But it bleeds into recklessness if you're actually doing it where you can't actually do any good by taking on that danger, right? And so that's where kind of courage lies. Courage lies somewhere. Aristotle would sometimes use a phrase, or we use it to talk about ages. Would say that actually you need to be able to lie in like some kind of golden mean. So being courageous basically means, according to this question in the chat, doing the risk calculation properly. So it involves a component of being able to do risk calculation, absolutely, and then being willing to act, right? So the fact is, have you done the risk calculation? And now given that, are you willing to act, right? And take on some possibly severe risk. Also, though, sometimes I would say courage can demand that actually you take on extreme risk. And that's when you're like, I think an example is actually Socrates was commended at one point for being courageous on the battlefield. Socrates was a soldier before he was a philosopher. And one of the reasons that he was commended for being courageous is that he would not retreat before other people, and actually he would stay fighting in a way that actually allowed other people to retreat more, right? Does he put himself at increased danger? Yes. Does he do something admirable? I think we would say yes. So it gets multifaceted, and with a lot of these things in the virtues, we talk about particular actions. We have to know a lot of the context you have to know a lot of the context basically in order to be able to assess any of these particular actions. I see someone else is saying that I am banned on Lit. I think that's on 4chan. I don't go on, and if they ban me, that's fine. Or if they're ban stuff about me, that's fine. But thanks for letting me know. The next thing, the next virtue that we want to talk about then is, let's talk about temperance. So temperance is sometimes always called moderation, or it can be called moderation. And essentially, temperance is like the virtue of restraint. It is the virtue of being able to hold yourself back and to regulate your own desires. So I am at all of you in the chat, or anyone who would watch this, have some desires for things you want, right? And sometimes it's okay for you to go and fulfill those desires, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it actually would harm you or harm others in order to do that. That's an easy case. An easy, yes, someone else saying also self-control. Yes, self-control is another great word for temperance here. That an easy case of this is, think about like food, right? It is nice to eat like rich food, food that's like really flavorful and stuff. That can be really pleasant and pleasurable, and it's good in moderation, we say, right? Because if you eat too much, you will get sick, right? And one of the kind of ironies of not having self-control is that when you eat too much of those things, you actually end up not enjoying the act of eating them anyways, right? So now that's just a food example for temperance. Temperance can actually be applied to just about everything. And I think in the ancient world, especially when you look at the Stoics and like the Cynics are kind of hardcore on this side, but the Stoics are a little more moderate here. There's a thought that like temperance is really going to require you have to train yourself to be temperate, and you have to get used to being temperate in a way that's going to kind of require that you purposefully forego pleasure, and you kind of cut yourself off from certain pleasures completely. So Musonius Rufus, in his that little book I was highlighting in an earlier video, that one should disdain hardships, he talks about the fact that philosophers in his mind should actually go and live in caves, which is wild. It's wild to hear this, right? The philosophers should go and live in caves, he says, and they should live simply. They should buy cheap things that do their function and that are easy to replace. That's what Musonius Rufus says. And he says that if you don't do this, the problem is you're going to get weak, right? You're going to get weak and go soft. He uses the word effeminate. I would not use that word here, but he thinks it's like weak and soft, right? And epictize. Anyway, he uses these words like weak and soft. And the thought is that we must purposefully train ourselves to not succumb to pleasure, because it's very, very easy to succumb to too many pleasures. Even the Epicureans, right, who were famously hedonistic in the ancient world, they were not hedonistic in the way that we think of hedonism. They were hedonistic in a way of saying that pleasure is good, but most importantly, we want to avoid pain. And so what they actually did is lived lives that we would consider actually to be fairly stoic, actually by modern standards. So temperance is the ability to restrain yourself. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that super chat. That is really, really helpful. And thank you for this. By the way, folks, I don't make a lot of money on these chat lives. So super chat like that is so generous. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay. So let's think about some other examples of temperance really quickly here. How do you spend your money, right? I think a lot of us could exercise a kind of fiscal temperance in the sense of just not buying things for a while, just to break ourselves out of the habit of buying it, right? Or, what kind of food do you eat? Could you try to eat, oh, wow, suddenly I have the chats here. This is great. So let me just highlight this super chat for a second. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Okay, so you're not able to don't buy things for a little while. That's how you can train yourself to be temperate. Or eat food that's healthy for you, but not particularly fun to eat, right? Go and eat all of your vegetables or something like that. And just get yourself used to enjoying something because it's nourishing rather than like tasty. Now, I'm not saying you never have to be able to buy things that are nice for yourself or never can eat things that are tasty, but it's about training yourself to be okay with it, right? This was one of the things that the Greeks really emphasized, was this worry that we kind of had, was that if we didn't train ourselves, one day we'll lose what we have. If you get used to too much luxury, you will lose it one day. And if you lose it, then you're in for a world of hurt. It's not gonna be pleasant kind of at all. This is a good question here, that if you have to train yourself to be temperate, wouldn't that go against the idea that to be virtuous is the end of a human being? Not exactly, but it's a good question, and it's a good way for us to clarify here. So for all of the virtues, you have to train yourself. All of the virtues require a certain amount of training or education. Aristotle, when he talks about this stuff, really emphasizes moral education. The idea is that it is in your capability to be virtuous. You are totally capable of being virtuous, but we have to sort of work on the particulars, right? And we have to work on it to be able to actually really do it, right? I also like to use a phrase or like to describe virtues as like skills. They are skills that anyone can develop, but they're not skills that everyone possesses sort of from the womb. We all have the capacity to develop those skills. Almost none of us have any of them the moment we're born. It's why your parents teach you to share, right? It's why your parents teach you to regulate your desires. Stuff you have to learn as you have a young child is like, how do you teach them to regulate their desires? Essentially, you're teaching them to be temperate. We're saying it would be proper and characteristic and right for us, for the child to be like that, but he needs a little help getting there. We're going to help him. We're going to train him and raise him and educate him in that way. That was a great question, though. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so we have gone over courage and temperance. Oh, yes. So the virtue should enable communication and communion, not convince oneself in one's own self-satisfaction. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. the person who's like really virtuous actually is going to probably spend a lot less time thinking about themselves. That's one part that I think is really important. And that's why we're going to talk about justice next. So justice is really the most clearly of the social virtues, right? In the sense that, I mean, while the other virtues I've been talking about, like courageousness or courage and temperance, it's about like, how do I handle my own feelings and like act or something like this. What we have to do instead with justice is think about not just yourselves. There is justice towards yourself, but there is also justice towards others. And let's talk about some examples of that. I see some good questions. I'm going to save them later so we can go over some of these. So if I don't answer your question right away, don't worry, I might get to it. I will do my best. So when we're talking about Aristotle here, right, and we go back to our idea of two vices and the virtue is in the middle, well, the vice on the one hand for justice is actually selfishness, where you can only put your own interest forward, right? And then on the other end, there's complete selflessness, in which you are never capable of taking on your own considerations, right? The considerations of your own well-being. And for both Aristotle and the Stoics, they would say that both of those things are vices. So to be just, you do have to consider yourself, your relationship to people. So there's a certain amount of partiality, and also what is owed to you, like what is fair to you. But it cannot be the only consideration. This is why I didn't immediately answer this question, but now I think we can say for just a moment, which is that, not that one, I will go back to that one, but do I believe that humility is a virtue? A certain kind of humility is a virtue. A certain kind of humility is a virtue where it means that you are not inflating yourself, and it means where you are not too prideful in the sense like where you have delusions about your own grandeur or your own capacities. Like that's crucial. And also there's a kind of humility of focusing on your faults, maybe quietly and just not thinking about the things that maybe are particularly good about yourself, because that can lead to you being better as well. But there's a kind of false humility that some people think here, where like, if someone gives you a compliment and they're like, you look really nice today, and you're like, no, sorry, I look ugly, right? If you experiment with this, no, I look terrible. Like, that's a false humility, and that's not the kind of virtuous humility that we would want to talk about here. However, the worry, like the opposite of humility, right, or like the vice that's closely associated with this, is pride, right? And there's someone here, actually, someone just asked this question, so I'll show this a little early. Can pride be a virtue? In the same way that humility has to be understood correctly, pride has to be understood correctly as well. Acknowledging when you have actually done well is good. Acknowledging when you have overcome something is good. The kind of pride that we're really concerned with is an inflation of the ego, right? And it's where all you can do is put yourself first, even in your mind, right? So pride in that sense is almost like the selfishness of consciousness. It's the selfishness of your mind. I will get back to this question about being isolated, right? But this was a nice question here, is like, what weight does intention have when considering the just? So when we're considering if a person is just, right? If a person is it has the virtue of justice, their intentions matter greatly, because we're wondering, like, do they properly consider others in their decisions, right? And that is a large part of intention. But the reason you would ask this kind of question, feel free to add more in the chat if I get this wrong, because I'm going to speculate about your internal mental states, which is that you would ask that because you say, what if I had the best intentions, but something goes terribly wrong because I got the facts wrong, for instance, right? And that's why I'm going to talk about prudence in just a second, because we're going to see how all of these things start coming together as well. Remember at the very beginning of this, I was talking about eudaimonia and teleology and living according to nature. All of a sudden I said all of these concepts were connected. Well, it would not be actually unfair to say that all of the virtues are connected. It's hard to imagine someone who is perfectly just but imprudent, or perfectly temperate but unjust. Like if you're truly virtuous, you're going to kind of have all of the virtues, right? So we will go over prudence in just a moment. Do I believe here that the Stoics focus more on the collective than the individual? It's not that they focus more on the collective, it's that they understand individuals as social beings. And so you as an individual are inherently social. To be a human being is to be social in some capacity. It's why someone else asked, can the virtuous be virtuous isolated from society then? I used to think the answer to that was yes. The worry that I have actually is that if you isolate yourself too much, you never have a chance to practice justice, right? Or you never have a chance to practice some of these other things, right? So that's, I think you need that social capacity in order to be properly virtuous. JP, thank you so much for the super chat. This means so much here. Knowing that these virtues are something you do, actions, should you read or study about them or just go outside and learn from experience? You should do a little bit of both. Musonius Rufus has asked this question as well. He basically has asked, like, what is better, to be a philosopher or to be good, right? And he says, well, if you had to choose, you should go be good. However, really being a philosopher, right? To really be a philosopher is to be good, because you love wisdom, and you love the virtues. So you really are good. So here's what I think, to put this into some context, I think it is useful for us to study and read about them, because our conceptions of the virtues might be wrong, right? We might be wrong about this. It's also helpful not just to read philosophers, but to read, like, this is one of the great things about reading good stories, right? As I think everyone here knows, I don't just love philosophy, I love fiction. And one of the reasons we want to read good stories is we see examples of people that we want to emulate, or we see examples of people that we would never want to be like, right? And when you learn a little bit about that, like when you learn about the experience of being human a bit more by reading those books, you've done something, right? But it's all meaningless if you can't go out and live your life. So you got to go outside, and you are going to learn from experience, and you're going to make mistakes, right? A big theme I want to put forward here is that anytime you're thinking about this stuff, remember that you will make mistakes. It's not like you just decide to be virtuous and you're going to be perfect at it. Sometimes the Stoics suggest that. They seem to think like, oh, well, you have enough knowledge, and if you have perfect knowledge of the world, then you should just be perfectly virtuous. Aristotle, in that regard, might have a leg up on them, where he thinks that really virtue is a matter of a habit, right? It's a matter of being habituated. So eventually you will just sort of act virtuously, right? So thank you very, very much for this. I'll take one more question before we talk a little bit about prudence. So what would be just behavior according to Aristotle if you would be in the trolley problem? So, obviously Aristotle himself never writes about the trolley problem. He does not write about that example, because that example was born in the 20th century. But here's basically the problem with the trolley problem, or like the thing here. We have basically two options, right? One person's going to die when we run over a train, or you can pull a lever. No, sorry, three people are going to die. They're going to be run over by a trolley. You could pull a lever, and then it will go, and it will kill only one, right? And it's supposed to show a tension, because if you're like a utilitarian, you should clearly pull it. Nobody wants to pull it. If you're a Kantian, you say you can't pull it, but then you start thinking, oh, maybe I should pull it, right? When I've read virtue ethicists talk about the trolley problem, one of the things they say here is that this might be an example where there might not be a right answer, like as in the right action. What we want to think about in that case is, like, you don't want someone who would just like flip a coin, right? Who would treat such a serious matter like so flippantly. Right? You want them to be thoughtful and deliberative. Unfortunately, in a case like the trolley problem, is it possible to do well there? I just don't know. This is why I'm very glad I don't work on a railroad. I want to trick you a little, but I do feel that there are those with an internal commitment to be just. Because of this, it influences their communications, almost a stubbornness. There's to be just. Yeah, there is a kind of, like, you can be almost too obsessive about this stuff, right? And I think when people worry about the virtues becoming narcissistic or whatever, this is one of those reasons. But justice is a multifaceted concept for us. It means so many different things. It's not just like about the judge determining who did well and who deserves punishment or something like this. It's like the quartermaster who has to provide supplies to troops. It's how you run your family, right? It's how you deal with your friends, right? Here is a justice. Here is a virtue that I think is like really important. Is that open-mindedness, right? Open-mindedness essentially says that you are willing to be convinced. But I think open-mindedness is actually just a sub-virtue of justice, because basically to be open-minded is to say that I am willing to give you consideration. I am willing to listen to what you have to say. And if you can provide good reasons, real justifications, I am willing to change my mind. In that way, I'm treating you as an equal, right? So open-mindedness really just becomes a kind of justice when applied to a certain part of the social realm. So let's see here. Has the meaning of justice in modern times compared to what the changed compared to the Stoics actually there? Because there was a monarchy. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, right? And of course, there wasn't a monarchy when the Greeks were writing here. There was like an assembly, though there was also like a tyranny at times. Greek politics are strange and weird. It's not that the meaning of justice has changed, but there is something about like, what are just social orders? We disagree about those, right? But that's because none of us are exactly thinking like an ancient Greek, right? So certainly some of our opinions about what could possibly be just have changed. But like the meaning itself of justice, I think there's like a core of it which has remained this whole time. Let me just take a sip of this and then. Okay, let's talk about prudence. Prudence is my favorite virtue. And that's because I think you could make an argument. I'm not going to make it today, but I feel like you could make an argument that like if you are prudent, that guarantees that you have all of the other virtues. So prudence just is like the virtues, right? And it seems to me, and basically prudence is also translated as wisdom. So when someone was asking about translations, prudence is prudence and wisdom are basically the same here. Another way of thinking about prudence is to say that prudence is the virtue of being able to know where you are in the world, meaning like, what are your social conditions? What are the actual facts on the ground that are going to let you do that risk calculation in order to be courageous? What are the facts on the ground or the fact of the matter that's going to allow me to be just when I allocate goods, or when I try to punish someone who deserves to be punished, or reward someone who deserves to be rewarded, or to show mercy to someone who would benefit from that mercy? Prudence is always there. It's that ability of just knowing where you are in the world. And the hardest part about prudence is that it's probably the most important virtue in that regard. And it's probably the most difficult to cultivate without being, without getting hurt along the way. It's the one where you'll clearly make mistakes. So Fit to Be Read, who, by the way, has a really great science fiction channel. People should read it. I think, though, if I remember, I don't know, have we talked about this Fit to Be Read? I feel like I watched your review of The Sparrow, and I had some quibbles with it. But I think I watched everyone from the Science Fiction Alliance talk about The Sparrow, and I had some quibbles. So maybe I could quibble with all of you. But anyway, you asked, he had asked about intention and whether or not intention mattered for justice. Well, intention does matter for justice, but also you have to have that prudential aspect where you actually know what's going on. Like, you don't get to just act justly out of total ignorance, right? You actually have to know what the world is like in order to be properly just. So let me look through some more questions here in the chat, and then we will open it up. Those are okay. So like that's our quick overview. We've been talking for 45 minutes. That's like the quick version of the virtues. Here is like, I'll put this down in the description later if you want to come back and look at it. But here are the books that I would want to suggest to you if you want to learn about virtue. One is that you should read the Nicomachean Ethics. It's my favorite work of philosophy. It's the one I recommend the most, but it will go through all of these different kinds of virtues and you'll see lots and lots of examples. Another one is that title by Massimo Pigliucci on character. That's a very gentle introduction that you could look through it as well. And then there are some articles on virtue ethics and on the virtues that I would recommend as well. I'm going to put all of those in the descriptions after we end this broadcast. I'll end the live stream, and then I'll have to go take care of my kid for a little bit. Then I'll come back and I'll put those there. So if you want to know more stuff to read, that would be the place to look. Okay. So let's go through and just look through some questions in the chat. I'm good to stay for another 30 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat and we'll talk. So here, Michael was asking, the reason why I asked about the trolley problem is because it sounds like a good example of where virtue ethics isn't helpful to decide what to do. Why would you want to know what it should be if it doesn't help you decide what to do? Well, so that's the difference between virtue ethics and other ethical theories. Utilitarianism will tell you what to do, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about being a good person, like a person itself. You could be totally vicious on the inside, but be okay by utilitarian standards. And all the Kantian cares about is a kind of respect for the universal moral law. Virtue ethics begins by talking about character. And then the idea is that once you've kind of cultivated the right sort of character, you will be able to make good decisions in difficult situations. But in fact, the trolley problem is incredibly artificial, right? The trolley problem is not a kind of scenario you will encounter where it's very clean in the numbers and things like this. There's no uncertainty, all of that. So I would rather focus on training good individuals who could handle hard situations than I would on deriving the utilitarian calculus that's going to get us to apparently the maximal results. But maybe that's just a difference in temperament between you and I. Maybe it's something we'll have to hash out in future live streams. So Ellipsis asks a question of, given that we live very different lives from the Stoics, how do we make decisions on virtue on modern problems that don't translate from the text? This is another one of those cases where by trying to cultivate virtue or your character, right, as you try, you just get better at making good decisions. That's one of the reasons that I know I'm not virtuous yet. I keep making bad decisions. But let me tell you, though, a bit of advice that you would get if you asked Aristotle that question. So Aristotle actually has this methodology in the Nicomachean Ethics that's, I think, pretty commonsensical, right? When he wants to know what is virtuous, he just thinks that you should look for well-respected people in your community and you should ask them. You should ask them, give me examples of people who are brave. Give me examples of people who are temperate or just, things like this. And then you build a theory that kind of incorporates all of that. Part of this means that we need to have role models. Essentially, Aristotle is incorporating role models into his ethical theory. You need heroes, right? It's one of the reasons that I brought up the point about reading fiction. I think that you should read fiction because it gives you fictional heroes. You should read history because it gives you real life heroes. You should be involved in your community because you'll have heroes as well who can help mold you and ideally kind of help you, give you someone to emulate, right? Emulating someone who you think is virtuous and who has kind of demonstrated that publicly is really, really powerful. So that's one of the big things here. That's one of the things where we can't detach the virtues from actually how we actually live our lives, right? We can't detach the virtues from the fact that we're social beings. So let's find people who can sort of teach us more about this. This is someone here is asking a question about who's telling me what virtue is? Are we all just born with it? Where does Aristotle believe that these virtues come from? We are not all born with the virtues fully developed. We're all born for the capacity for virtue. And those virtues are given to us by nature, but we learn about how to be more virtuous by living in a community and being raised and educated and reared. That would be the quick version of that answer. Okay. Ivan has asked, is there a particular translation by an author that we should read of the Nicomachean Ethics? So the one that I recommend, I believe, is Bartlett and Collins, published by the University of Chicago Press. However, there's a Cambridge edition that's just fine. I think there's the Jonathan Barnes as well. And here's the thing, my Greek is very, very bad. So I'm not telling you this based on the assessment of the Greek. What it is with the Chicago one, I like it because I found it very easy to read when I was learning Aristotle for the first time. For the others, though, this is a more general this is a more general tip about translations, because if you join my Discord, for instance, there's a link in my page, by the way, if you want to join. We talk about translations all the time. Which translation of Dostoevsky should I read? Which translation of Kierkegaard should I read? The answer probably is that most of us won't be able to tell the difference if you don't have language skills. So what you should do is you should pick translations that are published by publishers that you trust. Don't look for scholars, because none of us know enough to be able to assess all of the scholars. Look for publishers who are doing the hard work for you of picking a good translation. This is especially true for philosophy. For fiction, I just think there's probably more bad translations floating around. But for philosophy, if you look at, and the publishers I would suggest that you look at are Hackett, Oxford University Press, the University of Chicago Press, and Cambridge University Press. There are others that are good. Notre Dame's a good publisher. A lot of people have a lot of people, like a lot of universities, have their own presses and stuff, and that's fine. That's great. But I would just say that in general, if you go with Hackett, Oxford, Cambridge, or Chicago, you are probably doing okay. And you probably won't be run off because you have such a terrible one. So like Michael here said that he has one by Terrace Irwin published by Hackett. That one's fine. It's totally fine. And those Hackett editions, those Hackett books, they're cheap. They are very affordable. I should probably start recommending Hackett more on this channel, especially for international readers or something who are looking for slightly more here. What about Penguin publications? They seem to be the most popular, most available. I don't think the Penguin ones will ever be terrible. I don't think that they tend to be as up to date with like philosophical commentary or anything like that. I think they use slightly older translations sometimes. But you shouldn't be, it wouldn't be totally, it wouldn't be awful for you to read those, right? So, it would be fine. If that's the one you can get, if you can get your hands on a Penguin classic of Aristotle, then just get it. If that's the only one that's available to you, just grab it. Don't be worried that you didn't get, Jared's like preferred translation. Just grab the one that you can afford and that's available. Odds are it will be better for you, right? Don't let the perfect here be the enemy of the good, where the good is just actually reading the stuff, and that the perfect would be trying to like the best translation. Okay, so this question is here. Which translation should we avoid then? So there are a lot of free translations on the internet of a lot of these texts. Some of them are really reputable. Some of them aren't. The problem is it's hard for you to tell, and it'd be hard for me to tell too, right? I have to like ask people I know who are like specialists in the field. But those Oxford World Classic series, which are also mentioned, those are almost always just fine. My preferred translation of Augustine's Confessions is the Oxford World Classic one as well, over like more modern ones. Just as an example, I have Penguin Classics in my library. I have a huge amount of Penguin Classics. It is as my like for ebooks and stuff. So I would say any of those are totally fine. I understand the impulse to want to read free translations online, and some of them are really good. And odds are you're not going to be like, your life's not going to be ruined because of it, right? You're going to be okay. But you just also have to look around, basically, or you're like, you have to ask around a little bit more if you're going online. I hope that helps. It's just like, learn to trust certain publishers, and most of the time that will benefit you. Yeah. Someone's here. Great to catch you live. Just started watching your content yesterday. Binged a lot of it. Oh, I'm so glad. I'm glad you could find some of it useful. There should be more content coming soon. I think I have something coming out early next week. And hopefully we'll have 2 or 3 more videos this month. So just always trying to get, keep you guys entertained. But also, I really appreciate that you watch. I love talking to all of you about this. Okay, I think the chat is mostly dying out. I don't see a lot of other questions, but let me try to wrap some of these up. Rebecca points out that the recommends the Notre Dame University Press edition. I think that's of the Nicomachean Ethics. I'm sure that one's fine. I don't know who the translator is, but I'm sure it's fine. We just type in this in though. Nicomachean Ethics, Notre Dame. Okay, I can't quite find it fast enough to make it worthwhile. But yeah, I am sure it's totally fine. So thank you for pointing this out. This question: Are people in our community more? Do they tend to be courageous more than ever? Is that the question? Some people tend to be courageous. Many people are not. Right? Courage is hard because it does feel uncomfortable. It does involve putting yourself at risk. I think the ability to say something, for instance, that could be unpopular, right? Um, Having courage to be disliked. Many of us don't have that. I don't have that. Yeah. Let me just grab a few more of these. Started the Creative Act today for your recommendations. Oh, I'm so glad. The Creative Act is such a fun book. I just sold so many of my books because we're planning on moving. We're trying to sell our condo and move into a bigger place because we had the baby, and so I finished reading the Creative Act and then I sold it. But I'm sure a copy will make its way back into my home at some point. I hope you enjoy it. What are my thoughts on absurdism and the myth of Sisyphus? Absurdism more broadly, it seems to make sense to me, but has some contradictions with some of my Stoic beliefs. So I don't believe that life is absurd, right? And the Stoics don't either, really. And so that's going to be the big difference. I see meaning in life. I see a kind of order to the world, and I kind of see everyday interactions imbued with meaning in a way that I think kind of just means I'm just not an absurdist. Right? However, like when you talk about the myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus is condemned to this horrible fate, but he toils, and that's kind of the hard part, right? He toils, but he has to endure it, and he doesn't ever like profit from it, right? He doesn't ever like get to do anything with it, and that's kind of the hard part. Okay, let's see. What is the difference between Socrates' philosophy and Stoicism, given that Zeno was inspired by Socrates? So all ancient philosophy pretty much is inspired by Socrates. And if you read Massimo Pigliucci's book on how to be a Stoic, which is very good, it's a very gentle introduction. He has this kind of chart, and it's like a family tree. You get Socrates, and you get Plato, and there were other students of Socrates. But then you get Aristotle, so that's how you get the Peripatetics. You get the Cynics and then you get the Epicureans, and you get the Stoics, and all of this. All of them take some of Socrates and then change something, right? One of the big differences here, I think, is that the Stoics, I believe, had different metaphysical views. So they believed everything was physical, for instance. Socrates, I don't think, had that particular view. It'd be hard to make the case that Socrates was a physicalist. The Stoics had those metaphysical views. They might have also had slightly different views about like the Logos or something like this. I don't know if Socrates had any view of something like that. There are many other differences. It's hard, though, to talk about with Socrates, because do we mean Socrates as presented by Plato? Because that's all we have. But is that really Socrates, or is that Plato? That's a complication. Have I read any Asian classics? I have a couple of Asian classics sitting on my shelf. Actually, I take it back. They're not on my shelf right now. They are in a storage container because, again, I packed up the vast majority of my books in order to eventually sell this condo, to eventually move into a house. So I don't have access to them right now. I've read a little bit of Chinese philosophy. I've read a little bit of classical Arabic philosophy and Islamic philosophy. I have not read basically any Indian philosophy. It is on my list of things to fix. The schedule has gotten weirder for me because of the baby and because we're trying to move, but that's like a multi-month process with selling and buying all that stuff. But hopefully I'll get to it. I'll get to it soon. I would like to read more Indian philosophy. It's something where I really have missed out here. Okay, let's see. So if the Stoics get the virtues from nature, how did the first philosopher gain this knowledge? How can you prove these virtues are worth living? So the first philosophers get them actually through observation of how people were already living. The kind of assumption there, I think, is that generally a social order will produce virtuous people. So I think that's where we get it. We actually get it from partly in experience, right? By living in a community, right? What is my favorite mythical story from all the world? So I love Greek myths. I've just loved the ancient Greek world for a long time. There's a kind of ongoing joke in my house that I think King Arthur was real, in the sense that I think there was some historical figure who eventually a lot of stuff about Arthur was attributed to. If you count Arthur as a myth in like the true and proper sense, then actually the Arthurian legends are my favorite mythologies. Though I love Arthurian legends so much. I don't know why I do so much, but I love them. And a book I recommend to everybody, I feel like everyone should have it, is Bullfinch's Mythology. You'll learn so much about mythology, especially like in the West, basically. It's so worth having on your shelf. I let myself pick 20 books to keep on my shelf when we were moving. So I could have 20 books to pick from. I had the Iliad, I had the Odyssey, I had one book of Aristotle, I have a couple things of Stoicism that I needed for the channel. One of the things, though, that I kept was Bullfinch's Mythology. How do I think that Seneca deals with the problem of evil in his essay on Providence? That is a very, very good question that I will not answer today because I want to do an entire live stream about it at some point. So thank you for it, but I will talk about that more here because I think that would be really interesting to talk about in detail. What does the logos actually mean? So logos actually, I think, just literally translates as like word, right? But it's like the rational structure or the rational mind of the universe. Obviously, that word in Christian theology takes on a different meaning. It gets identified with the second person of the Trinity. But it's this kind of, the rational mind of the universe might be the best way to put it. Or it's the thing that makes the universe intelligible. Do you think Aristotle and the Stoics would at least partially agree with MacIntyre's takes? I think they would partially agree, but the hard part that we're going to run into is that for MacIntyre, right, no one can be a pure Aristotelian or no one can be a pure Stoic. All of it is a matter of receiving a tradition, but a tradition is always transformed as you receive it, right? It's never a one-to-one thing. It's never a perfect copy. So we'd have to see how they receive it, right? What has MacIntyre added? MacIntyre would add the theological virtues, right? So that's gonna be a point of contention. What would Aristotle say about caritas? I don't know, man. That's difficult to figure out. So here, I did just become a dad. Became a dad about 2 months ago. It's been great. It's been the best time of my life, but it's hard. All right, thoughts on Islamic philosophy. From what I've read, I'm very impressed. Also, Islamic scholars are the reason that the West has a lot of Aristotle. At least that's one theory. I know there are some people who disagree with this as just a matter here. I remember reading some, I think Ibn Sina, and you see stuff that like Aquinas was going to use way later, like way earlier. Like Ibn Sina totally scooped him, right? He had it all. And so, I mean, there's lots of interesting systematic work going on there, especially on the metaphysics side. Is antinatalism taken seriously in academia? Not that I know of. I know some people will actually, do argue for it. It's not a mainstream position by any means. I knew one person who taught a little bit of that in their intro to ethics class. I don't think it went over very well, though. Okay, both Ivan and Rebecca asked the same question. What books on the Arthurian myths would I recommend, or what's the best book? Thomas Mallory is probably the person to read. Just read Thomas Mallory first. Though I love The Once and Future King by T.H. White. It's a modern adaptation, but I love The Once and Future King. It's such a great modern adaptation of it, and it's stunningly beautiful at times. Someone asked me about my thoughts on the myth of Prometheus. Other than that, I find it very compelling. There is something deeply human here about just this ability to grab something here and then in order to like bring it to the world, right? What more else do you want me to say about it? I'm not totally sure. Thank you so much for the super chat here. I really appreciate it. I love these. I'm going to be trying to do these streams weekly. In 2 weeks, I'm doing a stream where another booktuber and I are going to talk. He and I are probably going to talk about fantasy novels, though. We're going to take a break from philosophy and talk about fantasy novels for a while. But it's been great. I love interacting with folks, and this is so much fun. And thank you so much for the support. It means a lot to me. Okay, got a personal question here. Did I grow up religious? I converted to Orthodoxy as an adult. I grew up religious. I was an atheist, actually, for a long time. Eventually, I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy as an adult. Okay, as a big Aristotle fan, what are your thoughts on Aquinas? Do you think you'll cover him in your channel soon? Aquinas is a stunning thinker. right? He is genuinely stunning. At one point, I wanted to do like a really long study of the Summa. I had an English Latin version, like a full version, and I gave it away to someone else because I just don't have time. But he's stunning. I don't think I'll cover him in any depth, though. I just don't know enough here. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Spirit, for the super chat. It means a lot to me. Hope you and I should talk soon. I think it'd be fun. Okay. I've got this long question. It's coming up in multiple parts from Geezer, I believe. Virtue seems to be a very broad term. Socrates said that the only virtue was prudence, wisdom, whereas Plato argued the ones we've discussed. Aristotle listed like 13. Virtue hasn't been practiced the same. How does virtue relate to existentialist philosophy? Does virtue precede a human existence or its essence? An existentialist view discards virtue. I do think that the existentialists discard virtue because they don't have a strong sense of human nature. In order to talk about the virtues, I think you need a view of human nature. That's probably integral. With the case of like Aristotle, I think the case here is that many of those virtues could be grouped under the 4 cardinal virtues. That's what the Stoics seem to think. It's what Plato seemed to think. But the fact that people quibble about some of the details, I think actually shows that there's something really meaningful there, right? That virtue itself is certainly desirable. We just want to make sure that we enumerate them correctly. I hope that helps. Do you see any connection between the ethical thought of Kierkegaard and MacIntyre? Probably, but I don't know enough about Kierkegaard to say too much. So I'll have to punt on that one. Please forgive me. Courageous question here. Is it wrong to try and convert someone of religion? Here's my view about that. I say this as someone who is religious, right? And so I'm sure people have thoughts, but I think that having respectful conversations about your beliefs with people is actually good. And if someone earnestly wants to know something about your religion, you should talk to them. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that what people often are offended by and annoyed by is when people are kind of very in your face and like they want to start the conversation and be like, why haven't you converted yet or something? And so you just really, anyone there, but it's not just religion there, right? That's just a matter of like not being a jerk when you talk to somebody. It's just a matter of just be kind. Just be kind and be open-minded when you have conversations. Last week I saw Nick Offerman's book and I thought I recognized books from Lost Art Press. Do I practice woodworking? I'm a very amateur woodworker. I'm temporarily pausing it all because of the move. I've had to box up everything. I'm hoping to move into a house where I can turn a garage into a shop. But yeah, I'm an amateur woodworker. I want to do more. I've built a little bit of the furniture in our house, not very much of it. I'd like to build a lot more. My dad actually is a hand tool woodworker. So he will he will actually only use vintage tools that he restores himself and builds. And I find that so admirable. But I love my drill. Let's put it that way. I love my drill and I love my impact driver. Someone here. You introduced me to Guided by Voices. Thanks. Guided by Voices, best band in the world. Best band in the world from the best state in the world, Ohio. So yes, I'm so glad. If you haven't listened to Guided by Voices, folks, go listen to Guided by Voices. Okay. What do you think will be the first book you read to your son? Well, I've read books to my son. Like we've read through whole books, but they're kids' books, right? We read a lot of Dr. Seuss. Right now, we're reading Shel Silverstein. We read a few poems a night. That's been really great. But the first work that he heard, the very first thing he heard, or let's say the first three things that he heard, he read something from the Psalms, some of the most beautiful poetry ever created in the world. He heard something from Walt Whitman, and then he heard something from Dr. Seuss. It was those three things. Am I familiar with Islamic philosophies and the views therein on justice? I don't know as much about the Islamic like juridical tradition or anything like that. But I am a little bit familiar with Islamic philosophy. I took like a bonus class about it when I was in undergrad, and I did enjoy it. It was interesting to learn. But let's see. When you're done covering the Stoics on your channel, do you think you'll do more videos? I definitely want to talk about Aristotle. I'm working on a video that should come out in like 2 weeks on happiness, right? On views of happiness and how to be happy. That's basically it. But it's all about Aristotle. It's all about the ancient Greeks. It's and a lot of the Stoics, but Aristotle's featuring heavily. So I'm going to expand out a little bit from the Stoics because I don't want to just talk about the Stoics. In a way, we should learn from all of them and then try to figure out what we can incorporate into our lives as we build a philosophy that actually makes sense for us. Okay, folks, we are, I think, basically at time. I think I said I could do another 30, and I've done maybe 20. I'm going to lose my voice, and that's the reason I really do have to go. Thank you so much. I'll try to do this. Maybe I think Thursdays are better than Sundays. Actually, I'll stick around longer. I was doing these on Sunday afternoons, and I think Thursday just works better for me, but I think it works better for you folks too. I think the attendance is better. So if you could tell me down in the chat, do you think Thursdays are a better time for me to doing these live streams than Sundays? I mean, this is your chance to decide, right? If not, though, if you don't have any thoughts, you can just log off because I'll log off in just a minute. But thank you so much for joining me, everybody. Really, this has been so much fun. And next week, I think we're going to be talking about friendship. But I have to look at my. Okay, I see a few people say this. The Socratic method would be a good stream. Someone says Thursdays. Cool. We might do these Thursdays. Next week, I believe that we are going to talk about Aristotle and the Stoics on friendship. And that's going to get us out of that egoism as well. And then the week after that, I've got a guest from another booktuber. He's going to come on, do a live stream with me. We're going to talk about fantasy novels, just to have a little bit of fun. All right. Thanks, folks. I will talk to you all soon. Thanks for joining me. Take care.